Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Success Reimagined. I'm your host, Dr. Amna Shabbir, and today we're talking about perfectionism, anxiety, and the subtle ways they shape the lives of high achievers. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Clarissa Ong, the co-author of the powerful and compassionate book, which many of you have read, The Anxious Perfectionist. Welcome to Success Reimagined. I am Dr. Amna Shabbir, your host on this journey to thrive at the intersection of ambition and wellness. In every episode, I'll help you challenge outdated definitions of success, discover practical tools and strategies for growth without compromising your well-being. I am so glad you've joined me. Let's reimagine what's possible together. Dr. Ong is a clinical psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of Louisville. Her research focuses on acceptance and commitment therapy, also known as ACT, process-based therapy, OCD, hoarding disorder, and perfectionism. She's published over 60 peer-reviewed papers and is helping shape how we think about behavior change in both clinical and everyday settings. Dr. Ong, welcome to the show. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That's really kind of you.
I would love to hear, what is your definition of perfectionism?
So I think of perfectionism as, at its core, characterized by rigidity. So I think of perfectionism as rigidity with respect to some rules, which are usually really high, unrealistic expectations for oneself, and the sort of consequences that come with holding onto those rules really rigidly, which is like, if I don't meet them, it means this about me. I might have really strong emotional reactions or like thoughts that may not be super helpful. So I think like at its core, I think of it as about like rigidity.
That is such a powerful, single word around which we can center this conversation. So thank you for sharing that. How did perfectionism, if any, shape your personal journey? You alluded to it a little bit in the book, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I would say that I definitely can resonate with the concept of perfectionism. I've been in school for such a long time, and for a lot of the time that I was in school, like getting good grades was something that I thought was really important. And when I went to grad school and started working with Dr. Michael Tuig, who is a co-author of the book, who was my graduate school advisor, Mike is not at all perfectionistic. And so I think having exposure to that kind of mentorship was really, I don't know, life-changing, honestly, for me. And so I think the way it played a role, I think, is learning, I don't know, how like to keep the parts that I really like about perfectionism, but also integrating like this idea of values, right? What do we want our life to be about at the end of our life? When we look back on it, what do we want to have done? Or like, what do we want to have stood for? So I think, and that's just been a constant journey.
The part of the book that surrounded values, I found very valuable, for lack of a better word. It was just a very neat and unique way in which you had both explored this topic and you just touched on it. How do we look at values from this lens of perfectionism? We're just really focused on achievement and that next step. Where do values come into this if you were to take us down a little bit deeper?
Yeah, I think one of the big ways which you kind of were getting at is typically how perfectionism manifests is this focus on outcomes, right? Like I mentioned, like I really care about my grades. It's not about like, did I learn the material? It's about, did I get an A? But my value in the sphere of education is about learning. And that's why I'm doing this job. And I think when we focus so much on outcome, we lose sight of like the value in the process and the like doing. So I think where values can be helpful is, I guess, like anchoring us in that present moment in the ing, in the ing part of the activity, and connecting with, in this moment, why does this matter, rather than in a week when I see what happens. That's when it matters. I think values also carry this, approach-based quality, right? Because so much of perfectionism and many other psychological like struggles are about, I don't want to feel this way, I don't want to think this way, which is a very avoidance-based agenda. Whereas values are like, this is who I want to be, not like, this is how I don't want to live. or I don't want to have anxiety. So I think it also adds that like I'm striving for, well, I guess maybe, yeah, it's like something I'm approaching. And I like pause when I said striving because I think that's also a very perfectionistic like pattern.
Wow. That was really helpful, the way you kind of broke it down. So if you take a look at that, what you just shared in terms of values, and you could give us an example from your personal life or from the lives of people that you have touched and helped, how would we break it down? Because I feel that in these days, the word values is again taking this form of almost like this pop culture word. Like we love to use throw the word vulnerability, authenticity. Now, what are your values? So I really want to stay here for just a second and have you walk us through what if there was a moment that you realized how powerful it was to really lean into your values and how that shaped your perspective on how you looked at perfectionism showing up.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Let me think. Okay, I'll just use the example that comes to mind. I don't know if it's like the most prototypical perfectionism example, but I have a people pleasing tendency, or I have some rule around like, oh, I want people to like me, or I don't want people to dislike me. And I think the inflexibility shows up around, trying to do all these behaviors to try to make sure that I'm meeting the standard. So I don't know, maybe I don't know, I could be being ingratiating. I don't know if I noticed that, but I could see, or like over apologizing. That one I definitely know that I do. And I think I've been trying to focus more on, so the values you mentioned of like authenticity and vulnerability are definitely like things that I value and want to, I don't know, embody. And so I think I've been thinking more about showing up authentically rather than like showing up in a way that is about impression management. So yeah, so like being more willing to like say things rather than like, oh my gosh, will this person take it the wrong way? Will they think I'm being offensive? And more just like, this is how I feel about things. So I don't know if that's the best example, but that's one that I've been thinking a lot more about recently.
That reminded me of a part in the book which really struck out for me. There's a sentence there: perfectionistic behaviors make life easy for the other people. So it just like reminded me of that. And it's almost that perfectionist. I have felt this myself, and people pleasing. I find that as a great example because it's like we're carrying this weight of making life that runs smoothly for others. And it's almost this very like performative element. I do feel that there are large parts of my life that sometimes I'm just in a play, like literally, I'm just acting because I don't want people to see that other vulnerable side of me that's struggling.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. So I also feel like on the like introvert, extrovert kind of spectrum, I definitely lean more introverted, and it takes an amount of energy to be like on. And I think I noticed like working really hard to bring the energy out because there's some rule around like you need to like bring positive energy to any social space you're in. So, yeah, and right, because when you bring in sort of like low energy, other people might feel like, oh no, like, do I have to take care of this? And it's always easier for everyone if you're just, I'm great, life is great, and please don't worry about me, or we don't have to talk about anything going on in my life, something like that. So, yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Sometimes you just have to be you don't, everything doesn't have to be like a cheerleading situation. So I totally relate to that. I'm curious to know why you both chose the title, The Anxious Perfectionist. I appreciate the combination of the word. Why this specific combo?
Yeah, that's a less romantic story. That's the title that the publisher wanted. And I think honestly, I think they were thinking like, oh, like what captures, the book in a way that people can relate to. And I think that's something well, I guess I won't speak for Mike, but I think that's something I have less experience in, and what titles or headlines are good. So I was like, okay, these publishers know what they're doing. So we just yeah, and it made sense.
Well, I think they made a correct recommendation because I was definitely drawn to the title, and as are many people. I know I started putting out social media posts on my struggles on perfectionism, and actually somebody went in the comments and recommended the book, and I was like, "Oh, this is great." So I reached out for it. Absolutely. There was a part of the book I was vigorously shaking my head because I listened to it. So I can't hold it in my hand. I'm going to order the workbook situation with it. But there was another part that I really found relatable, and that is when you mentioned living in the limbo of almost. And I'm going to read that sentence a little bit. Like, the dinner party was almost perfect, except that you burnt the green beans. Why is this almost perfect space? It's just so sticky. And how do we recognize that we're stuck in it? Now that I'm like stopping and realizing, I feel like I'm almost in almost all the time.
Yeah, I think one reason it's so sticky is it makes it feel like you can get to enough, I think, right? Because it's like, "Oh, I'm so close. If I just do a bit more of X or a bit more of, XYZ, then I'll get there." And I think so I have had clients who are really high achieving, and I've, talked about how, it almost, is less helpful that you're high achieving because you've probably met unrealistic expectations at some point in your life, so it feels like you have to keep meeting them because you can. And so I think that's what the almost is. It reinforces what I think is an illusion that we can get to a place where we will feel like we're enough in the context of perfectionism. And the second part of how do you notice if you're in that almost? That's a really good question because I think it's different for everyone. I think for me, it's that desperate kind of feeling. And I think it's different for everyone, but there's probably some, I don't know, I would guess that there's some internal kind of constellation of reactions that shows up when it feels like you're just trying and trying and it feels like you're really close and you're just not getting there. And I think, yeah, probably starting by noticing, like you're saying. And then once you can notice what's happening in this instance, potentially then noticing, is there a pattern as I start noticing over time? But for me, it always feels very desperate.
As you were talking, I almost could feel this sensation in my body because I've been trying to be aware more, like having an embodied presence, and I'm always in my brain. And when you mentioned that it shows up differently for everyone, it's almost this dread I feel that just settles in my core. And it just reminds me that I'm almost there, but not quite yet. And you have to keep going, whether it's like professionally, whether it is my social or my cultural outlook to the world, like whatever is being hurled at me. So that was just like a fascinating thing that came up for me.
Yeah, that's cool because I think a huge part of trying to go for outcome and constantly evaluating is we live in our heads so much that our body might be reacting in all these ways, but we're not attuned to it. So I think that, I don't know, I really appreciate that visceral connection with what it feels like to be just striving all the time.
Yes. So you mentioned earlier the word striving. You're trying to stay away from it. So one of the things that has happened as I've spoken with amazing, brilliant minds such as yourself is the words we choose, and everyone has like their own set of words that they're trying to stay away from. And I saw you kind of walk away from striving a little bit. Why?
Yeah, because at the start I mentioned perfectionism was very much characterized by rigidity, or at least that's a core component. And when I talked about striving for value, so I think there are times when people who are so used to holding on to things rigidly then just replace rules or unrealistic expectations with values, right? So then values kind of function as rules, which sort of loses the essence of what they are. So when I talked about striving for values, I was being mindful of, so it's not to say now I always have to be authentic, and if I'm not authentic, a hypocrite, or now I always have to be present. If I'm not being present, I need to practice mindfulness more, right? Because then that's the same dynamic that is what's causing so much stress. And so I think that's why I was trying to be mindful. But I think striving can also be used in a helpful way as long as we hold on to it lightly. I think that's the whole thing. It's instead of rigidity, how do we introduce flexibility into either the words we use or the things that we're striving toward?
Anyone who knows me personally knows that I struggle with holding things lightly. I'm trying not to laugh too much because my husband would love listening to this part of the conversation because he would be like, well, now you're right. Like, if I'm showing up authentically, what does that mean? For me, I've just, going on a more personal note, just decided for with social media, just there are times when I'm way more put together and then there are times when I'm not. And I think that if I decide to show up in all the times that I'm not, that is inauthentic. But it's this space of how can you be between two spaces and not necessarily be in this dichotomous black or white situation. It's so hard for us because everything around us, those are the stereotypes that are perpetuated.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know what I would attribute it to, but I think that binary, like all or nothing thinking is really not uncommon just in general, like media, like kind of mainstream culture. And I think I also notice the tendency to like, oh my gosh, should I do this or should I do this? And it's like, oh, like what would be a middle path for in all these like binary or like kind of, I don't know, false binaries, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shifting a little bit into the part of the book, you talk about the coherence trap. And I was driving and I was listening to this part, and I was again vigorously shaking my head because I do try to always feel like I'm trying to make sense of everything in a very specific way. And so you talk about this cost of logic, which I found very fascinating. Can you please explain these two terms for somebody who's never heard them before and how they apply to perfectionism?
Yeah. So when I think of the coherence trap, it's kind of like what you said. It's this very strong drive for humans to want to make sense of things, right? Like that the world needs to make sense in some way. My life story needs to make sense in some way. My behaviors need to make sense in some way. And they have to, like, this sense of like they should fit a coherent narrative. So, for example, like I mentioned, I, like, kind of lean on the introverted side, so, therefore, like, I can't go to parties because that's not what introverts do, and if I do go to a party, I definitely, like, wouldn't enjoy myself, and I definitely, like, have said that to myself before going to, like, social gatherings. It's like, "Oh," and for all that to make sense, like, my experiences need to line up with that,
Mm.
and if I'm so focused on making sure that my story is intact, if I'm focused on, like, protecting this narrative, then I would probably show up very differently to a party than if I was like, "Oh, I don't know, let's see what happens." So I think there's a bit of that, like, kind of self-fulfilling nature to that. So I think part of the cost of that is that we kind of disconnect from our lived experience. So it's like we live in our stories that make a lot of sense, but not the experiences that may not fit that story. And I think having a story that makes sense is very appealing. One, because we just like things to make sense just as humans. And second, I think because I think it can feel like we have a sense of control. I can predict what will happen because things are, make sense. And humans really don't like uncertainty. We really don't like feeling like we don't have control over things. So I think there are many reasons why it's a very reasonable thing to want. And I think it can disconnect us from just, like, being in our lives.
Being fully immersed in the moment instead of like trying to put labels to it and trying to make it make sense. That's a, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So, where do we go in terms of viewing perfectionism? And that's also been a very interesting thing on a more broader lens, because in having these conversations and trying to understand it from a standpoint of a clinician who struggles with perfectionism, but who's not a psychologist, who is not a psychiatrist, and looking from outward, sometimes I find myself confused. Is perfectionism a good thing or a bad thing? Or maybe again, I'm trying to fall into this coherence trap where I'm trying to make it make sense as I'm talking and I'm writing about it. I would love for you to like comment on that a little bit, because sometimes I feel lost. Like there are parts of me I do see that it has served me well. But then there's a very real growing recognition on how our society, and bringing in that socially prescribed perfectionism element of it, and how our society presents itself these days, where I feel like it's becoming less of a me problem and more of like this larger air that I breathe in, and it's not serving a lot of us well.
Yeah, so a very stereotypical psychologist answer is it depends. So and I think by that, what I mean is it's context dependent. I think there are certain times and spaces where being really rigid is helpful. And I think there are times and spaces where being less rigid is helpful. So, for example, like just as a very mundane example, right? The rule of I should stop at a red light. It's like probably holding on to that rule very rigidly will be helpful. And as someone who has seen people run through red lights, I definitely think that's a good one. And the rule of I have to be pleasant all the time, or I have to say yes all the time, or I can never say no because it means I'm rude. Like that one might be less helpful to hold on to. So I think whether it's good or bad, it depends. I think it's almost like if I think about it, it's like stepping back to what do you want your life to be about? And maybe that's like and it's sort of a values question. And then thinking of perfectionism or like the patterns in perfectionism as is it serving me to in building the life that I want at this moment? If yes, sure. And then if no, like let's see if I can let it go. So it's almost like perfectionism is I don't know. Besides the point may not be the best way of saying it, but it's not about perfectionism. It's about what do you want your life to be about and how does perfectionism fit into that? It's the secondary consideration.
That is a great answer. I definitely feel very held in that moment when you shared, where it's not about putting, again, these labels and it's good or it's bad, but how does it fit in your life? My moment of quiet, I do go and watch like funny Instagram reels on parenting. I feel like it allows me to cope better. And there are some really funny content creators out there. And one of them was talking about, please stop telling us about, like, we know we need sleep. It's just our children aren't sleeping. And why that example is popping up into my mind is because keep getting asked these questions with the work that I'm doing. Like, what's your morning routine? Do you sleep and wake at the same time? And it's these like narratives that are just out there. And as if like what I have to say to this person from a space of authority is then they have to take it in a very prescriptive way and apply it to themselves. Until they don't, they have to just feel like guilty and bad in that interstitial space, like whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not an analogy, but like a thing that I bring up is, Alice in Wonderland when she meets Cheshire Cat and she's like, oh, where should I go? And the cat's like, well, it depends on where you want to go. And she's like, oh, it's fine, like, wherever. And the cat says, okay, then it doesn't matter. Definitely very like liberally paraphrasing, but I think it's what is the direction? And I think a lot of times questions that I might get are like, should I do this or this? And it's like, well, but where do you want to go? And then, I can't answer your question until I know. If not, like, then you can do either. So yeah, I think that I can relate to that like tendency.
For the high achievers that are listening to our conversation right now and they're teetering on the edge of performance and achievement and everything in between, what are some of the things that you suggest that we can start doing today to embrace that more value-based identity and really not try and like make sense of everything with the coherence trap, but just what are some of the steps that we can start taking as we listen to this and start making life a little bit easier?
Yeah, that's a big question. Generally, I think about I guess probably like clarifying what your values are and not expecting that to be a straightforward process. I think with values, I think another rule is like, oh, of course I know my values. It seems like very obvious, but I don't think it is a lot of the time because it's not something like many people are really asked to think about. So I think clarifying values is probably a helpful step. And then I would say finding like, like the tiniest step or like a small moment where you can practice connecting with the value. So I think another tendency is like behavior change. I'm going to go all out. I need to replace everything with values. And that's probably, again, that falls back into the same dynamic. We're just replacing high expectations with values. So I'd probably say like start somewhere small and really, really pay attention to your embodied experience of what it's like to live in that space, which I know is pretty abstract, but that's like where I think of starting.
I think it's very tangible. And I agree with what you mentioned that when we talk about values, I always get the same answer too. And I myself felt that way. I feel that over the last 2 years in the process that have been towards working on my burnout, moral injury over the last couple of years, I've realized that do I really like, have I spelled out my values and are my values in constant flux? And have I really like looked inwards? So I think that is such a fantastic recommendation. I so appreciate your time today. Is there anything else you would like to add as we wrap up for today?
No, I guess I would just say like I think Kelly Wilson is someone who talks about values a lot in the ACT world. So I would definitely look up some of the stuff that he's done around values, because I think the way he talks about values is incredibly powerful.
We'll definitely make sure to add some sort of link to that. And as we wrap up, please also tell us, how can we learn more about your work and support you in your efforts? And of course, I'm going to drop the link for reading The Anxious Perfectionist. Please do share.
I run a lab at the University of Louisville. It's the process-oriented intervention science lab, so POIS, like POIS lab. So if you look at poislab.com and you're interested in participating in some of our research studies, that would probably be huge. And then the book. So those would be the two main things.
Thank you for that and the amazing, impactful work that you do and for your time today.
Thank you.
This episode is part of a special series and my budding book project on unmasking perfectionism. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. Just a quick reminder, while I am a physician, I'm not your physician, and nothing in this podcast is medical advice or any kind of professional advice. Everything shared here is based on my personal experiences, and the views expressed are entirely my own. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would love for you to rate, review, subscribe, and share the show with anyone who might need a little inspiration to redefine their own version of success. I'll see you next time. Until then, keep reimagining success one small step at a time.